Greetings all, and welcome to Luca Sprues. In today's video, we're going to be doing a build of a vintage 1/72nd scale KV-1 Type C from ESCI, which I've also designed and 3D printed a interior for, along with some tracks to replace the rubber ones in this old kit. So, without further ado, let's get into building this one. Off camera, I gave both the plastic sprues and 3D printed parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil or residue and help paint adhere to their surfaces before I began to cut out and clean up the parts for the lower hull. I assembled the lower hull, which fitted together quite well, and once it was dry I added the rear and front plates with their towing latches and began to cut out, clean up and assemble the turret. The fit for the turret was also quite good, and if you don't glue the centerpiece, you can elevate and depress the cannon. The cannon itself has a rather large seam line which required sanding before it was added to the mantlet and received a small piece to add the hole in for the barrel. The upper hull was cut out but not glued into place, as I had to still add the resin interior. For the interior, I first glue all the torsion bars to the floor with some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue. Following this, I then assembled the engine, including its various air filters, the rather large cooling fan, and the transmission. I set aside the engine to dry and glue the breech to a piece of sprue, and then glue the gunner's controls, radios, spare ammunition, and several other finer details to the inside walls of the turret. I test fitted the hull and turret before I add in the radiators, engine bulkhead, ammunition boxes, temporarily the driver's floor, and also the various smaller radios, machine gun ammunition boxes, lights and control panels inside of the hull and turret. The gunner and loader's seats were glued into their place, although I decided to leave the breech, driver's floor and engine unglued so that I could paint them before adding them to the rest of the vehicle. Moving back to the plastic parts, I added the mud scraper and front armor plate to the hull, and then attempted to add the hatch for the driver's position, which according to the instructions appears to be able to be open and closed, although they were rather fiddly and fragile. The front armored plate was glued onto the upper hull, followed by the driver's sight cover, a horn, a light, and a machine gun. The interior was then painted several coats of Vallejo model colours flat white, thinned with a bit of water to help it flow and prevent my layers of paint being too thick. I also painted the driver's floor, engines and the breeches white. While the first coat of white on the interior dried, I cut out the turret roof and attempted to assemble its openable commander's hatch, but once again I found the hatch parts were rather fragile, so in the end I decided to just leave the commander's hatch unglued. After 3 more coats of white, I got out some Vallejo model colour Russian uniform green and used it to paint the ammunition boxes, along with the gun breech and the gunner's controls. Vallejo model colour flat black was used on the machine gun ammunition, radio equipment, and for the driver and assistant gunners/radio operators seat covers. Several more coats of uniform green were applied, and then I decided to change the seat covers to Vallejo model colour chocolate brown. I painted the compressed air tanks for cold weather starts with XF18 medium blue from Tamiya, and continued to pick out fine details and the torsion bars with the Russian uniform green. If I made any mistakes, I'd clean them up using a fine brush and whatever colour I needed to fix whatever mistake I'd made. For the engine and some parts of the breech, I used Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium, and while that dried, I painted a few more coats of the finer parts. XF52 flat earth was used to paint the handles on the ammunition boxes, and the radiators and engine received another coat of XF16. The air filters to the sides of the engine were then painted Russian uniform green, the exhausts X31 Titan gold, the cylinder head cover with XF9 hull red, the piping for the air filter system with XF18, and finally some of the details on the engine and transmission were painted with some Vallejo flat black. After a few more coats of these colours, I painted the gunner and loader seats with XF65 field grey, and for the final time I changed the driver and assistant driver/radio man seats to this same colour. With painting completed, I then dry brushed some XF16 flat aluminium all over the interior parts to add some metal chipping. I then neatened up any mistakes I'd made and removed some of the excess chipping using the various interior colours. The turret roof and upper hull were both painted flat white while I waited for the various parts to dry, and after doing a little bit of cleanup around the hull to remove some excess plastic and improve the fit of the roof, I installed the breech by gluing it to the moving part of the turret's cannon. The turret roof fitted excellently with little gap, and thanks to the armoured piece that joins the top and lower halves of the hull roof could easily be locked into place so that both the turret and hull could be slid off at some point to reveal the interior without requiring any glue to hold them down. I added some additional armoured plates to the sides along with the brackets to hold the towing cables, the toolboxes which were glued to the mudguards, and the spare fuel tanks which were assembled and then glued onto their places. I probably should have sanded the mudguards down to make them a little bit more thinner and also done some dents and weathering, but I forgot to do this and decided in the end to just leave them as factory fresh, even if they were a little bit too thick for 1/72nd scale. The D-shackles were glued to the towing points at the front and rear of the vehicle, and then the interior received some Tamiya black panel liner scent to highlight all the details and give both the interior and engine a rather dirty and grimy appearance. I did try to cut out the hatches to access the transmission, but the plastic there was really thick, so in the end I stuck to just recessing them with a needle. At this stage, I moved on to painting the exterior of the vehicle, first with a coat of slightly watered down Russian uniform green on both the turret and the hull. A second coat was then applied, and I painted a coat of the Russian green on the wheels, which I'd left on the sprue, except for one sprocket which had accidentally come loose. 3 more coats of the uniform green were applied to the entire model to help build up the colour and give it a strong and uniform finish. I normally would add some cast textures to Russian vehicles as they tended to have rather poor production quality, and for this build I experimented by creating them using a large brush to blotch and stab paint on a 5th layer of the Russian uniform green. This seemed to be a rather effective method of adding a subtle armoured effect, which I'll probably be using on models in the future. Once the paint had dried, I added a gloss coat to the sides of the turret to prepare them for their decals, and applied some matte varnish onto the hull and interior to give them a dull finish. Admittedly, I probably should have waited a little bit longer for the green to dry, especially on the hull, as it mixed with the varnish and left some rather strange lighter green colours in some of the recesses, although it isn't really super obvious unless you look really hard. After giving the varnish 12 hours to dry, I selected some unit markings and a slogan from the rather ambiguous ESCI decal sheet, and found to my surprise that despite being 50 years old, they were actually in decent shape, albeit not as crisp and detailed as newer decals might be these days. Once they were in place, the decals received both some Vallejo decal softener and Tamiya decal adhesive so that they would conform to the textured surface, before they received a coat of matte varnish to help blend them in and also protect them. Once the matte varnish is dried, I then used some XF16 flat aluminium and a fine brush to create some chipping on the exterior. I mainly focused the chipping on the edges of armoured panels and the mudguards, and other areas that are likely to receive damage from the crews walking on them, or around the hatches where they might be opened and closed. I also added a fair bit of metal chipping on the raised details on both the sprockets and also all of the road wheels. Unfortunately, the rubber tracks in this kit were a little bit delicate and brittle, possibly due to their age, so I ended up replacing them with some 3D printed 700mm wide KV-1 tracks that I designed myself. These tracks were the OMSH style, which were mainly used in the early models, which seemed appropriate for this version of the KV-1. The tracks were painted Vallejo model colour 70864 natural steel to give them a bare metal look, and after 2 coats, I set them aside and used some Russian uniform green to soften the metal chipping on the rest of the vehicle. This technique not only helps to reduce the chipping, making it a little bit more subtle and realistic, but it also creates a faded and distressed look around the edges of the chipped areas. I then gave the tracks, hull, turret, and all of the wheels a thick coat of Tamiya black panel liner scent to help highlight their details and add a bit of grime and post shading. Once the panel liner was dried, I then used a cotton bud dipped in some X20 enamel thinners to rub off the excess and soften the effect until I was happy with it. I then weathered the underside of the hull with some Vallejo mud and grass effects, as well as some thick mud to create a build-up between the suspension. This was added using a cocktail stick, and then mixed and blended using a cotton bud. I also applied it to the tracks to get a little bit of the mud and grass effect stuck in the recesses of the links. I used Tamiya black weathering powder to create some exhaust stains near the exhaust area and also some gun smoke, while a heavy mix of the mud and sand pigments were applied over the mud guards and blended with a cotton bud. I also applied the mud and sand effects streaking down the sides of the hull and the turret, and once they were starting to dry, I used a large brush dipped in some water to soften and streak the effects and add a trailing effect down the sides of the vehicle, as if the dirt had been washed a little bit from rain or water. To add some dirt from the crew walking on the top of the turret, a heavy coat was also dusted onto the roof, and then I cut out and glued the first row of wheels into place. The first row of wheels all fitted quite well without any issues, although I did find that to add the resin tracks I had to cut off some of the sprocket teeth since they didn't quite mesh. Once I'd removed the excess teeth, I used some rocket odorless CA glue to glue the tracks to the sprocket, and then I glued it onto the first set of road wheels. The second row of wheels was then glued into place, which helped to lock the tracks in via their teeth, and then I repeated this process on the other side of the vehicle. With most of the weathering completed, I turned my attention to painting the finer details, including the exhaust, which was painted with X31 gold while it was on the sprue. The convoy light was painted XF16, followed by some X27 clear red, and for the front lights I used some Vallejo Model Air RLM01 silver. I gave the exhausts a second coat of the X31 before painting the machine gun barrels on the turret and hull with some Vallejo Model Air gun metal. The road wheels then received some weathering powders to make them a little bit dirty, and finally I added the exhausts into place and gave them a thick coat of rust powder to make them look a bit rusty. The edges of the exhausts were also painted flat black and mixed with a little bit of black powder to create some exhaust soot. This kit comes with two different figures, which I cut out, and after some light cleanup with a knife, I glued their arms to their bodies and started to paint them. One figure is in the tanker's uniform, which I painted a base of XF17C blue, while the second figure is wearing a more generic Russian uniform, so I painted it Russian uniform green in a similar manner. After a few coats of their base uniform colour, I painted their faces and hands with a coat of Vallejo's flat flesh using a fine SMS brush. 2 coats were applied of this colour before I then painted their helmets and boots using some Vallejo flat black. The figures' belts were both painted with Vallejo saddle brown, and I painted their shoulder boards a base colour of vermilion red, followed by black for the main colour, making sure to keep some of the red exposed for their piping. One figure also had a black strap, which I carefully painted. I neatened up any mistakes I'd made as I went, and once I was happy with the base colours, I added some belt buckles with RLM01 silver, as well as some buttons on the sea blue uniform, before sticking the figures on some blue tack and giving them a gloss varnish coat to protect their paint. After 12 hours, I applied a coat of Tamiya black panel liner scent to give them a dirty look and highlight their details, and since the effect was rather strong, I then got out some X20 enamel thinners and used a fine brush to remove the excess from some areas and help the enamel wash flow more into the recesses. When I was happy with the effect, I completed the figures with a coat of matte varnish and then set them aside. The last details I added to the tank were some 3D printed shells for the interior. I painted them first a base coat of X31 gold, and then painted the top of the shells with some Vallejo Model Air medium sea grey. Finally, the shells were glued to the interior of the tank in the hull and also on the turret ready rack, and after they'd received a coat of panel liner and I'd put my tank back together, the ESCI KV-1 with its 3D printed interior was finally completed. And here you can see the finished model. So on the whole, I'm really happy with the results I achieved, especially with my interior and the resin replacement tracks. I really love the old ESCI kits, and this has to be probably one of their best. With some really nice details, pretty easy assembly, and surprisingly resilient decals, and the crew figures, though not particularly well moulded, I still appreciate, and I really wish that more modern model kit companies would have crew figures for their tanks as standard to give them a bit of extra life. Some details I may later add to this tank include possibly adding some towing cables and spare track links, which this kit did have but were rather poorly done, and I also didn't add the towing rope while I was doing the D-shackles, so I may have to fiddle around to add those on later. I did consider also adding more storage to this kit, as well as some damage to the mudguards, but I instead decided to leave this one rather clean and empty looking, as though it's a reasonably recent arrival to the front line. If you're a fan of 1/72 scale tanks and you can find an ESCI or the later Italeri release of this kit, then I would highly recommend grabbing one and having a go. It's a simple but really nice model of the KV-1, and if you wish to add an interior like I did, then I will leave a link to my cults page in the description where you can buy the STL files to print for yourself. This is definitely not going to be my only KV-1 from ESCI, as I do have a second one to build, and I am considering doing a build video on that one as well, and possibly doing it in a winter scheme with a little bit more weathering and some other experimentation, but that's a video for the future. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel, as it really helps out. And if you have any questions, positive feedback, constructive criticism, or any future builds you'd like to see, then leave it down in the comment section below. A massive shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the products I use to make them. As I've mentioned, I've got a second ESCI KV-1, which I'd be tempted to do a build video on in the future. I'm hoping to also get done a inbox review of the new Hobby Boss and the old Academy Grumman Avenger for this weekend, although if it's not ready by this weekend, then definitely next week. I'll also have a vote for the next inbox review series in my community tab on YouTube, so go check that one out. Otherwise though, thanks again for making it this far and watching this video, and of course, as always, take care and model on.